to become a professional photographer for 40 years in Providence. And my wife and I moved to Foster, Rhode Island, and I became interested in studying lithic structures throughout the woods. These are stone chambers and cairns and all sorts of interesting stone walls that wound through the countryside. And I joined a New England Antiquities Research Association. There's a group of like-minded people all throughout New England, and we studied these structures. But the strangest structure of all was this tower in Newport, Rhode Island. And no one knows exactly who it was built. This is a picture from the 1800s when it went through what's called the viney period, where they allowed vines to grow on it. But you see that it's situated on a hill overlooking all of the Newport Harbor. This is Pagoda Island, Jamestown. And you can see all the way from the bridge all the way down to Fort Adams. Had a beautiful panoramic view. You can see every sunset throughout the year. Underneath each of these pillars is 3.5 tons of stone that goes 5 feet down to bedrock. This baby was built to stand for the centuries. And there's several windows in it. But below is 8 cylindrical pillars, an octagon shape. And then above it, it's totally a cylinder. Here from above, you can see the perfect cylindrical shape. And I get so excited, I sold my photography studio, bought this building, and now I have a museum there dedicated to the history of the tower. I've had 6,000 people from all over the country and Europe in the last 6 years. There's 5 theories about who built the tower. The Vikings in 1150. The Templars in 1398. There was a whole show on TV about this. Anyone see the show on TV? Yeah, yeah. And then there was the Chinese theory that it was built in 1421 by Zheng He. Came across the coast of Africa with these huge ships and built this as a Pagoda Lighthouse. And then the theory that it was built by Miguel Corto Real, the Portuguese theory, that he was actually shipwrecked, and they say he was abandoned here and built this while he was waiting for his brother, Gaspar, to find him. But when you're shipwrecked, you don't really have a lot of tools for building. But anyways, and then the first governor of Rhode Island, whose name was Benedict Arnold, not the traitor, but the great-great-great-grandfather of the traitor, in 1677, in his will, he calls it my stone-built windmill. So a lot of people think that it was a windmill. Here it is here. My stone in the deed that's up at the John Carter Brown Library. But windmills are all made out of wood, most of them. There were hundreds of them up and down the coast, and they all tapered to the top, and they had a turret that had to face the blades continuously towards the wind. Well, if it doesn't taper, and you had a 24-foot turret, that would be very difficult to move around. And then there's a horizontal shaft that goes to a vertical shaft, and the two grindstones grind against each other. Well, why would you have an open arcade and a windmill like in the tower? And this guy, Philip Means, who wrote a book in 1942 called Newport Tower, which is a compendium of all the knowledge that was learned up until that date. He says, this is the most un-windmill-like structure I've ever seen. Inside, there's a fireplace. And he says, you don't put a fireplace in a windmill because flour powder is more explosive than gunpowder. One little spark and the whole thing will blow up. So in the tower, these are beam sockets, and I've simulated where the first floor is. This would be the level of the first floor, right at the height of the arches. And then there's this fireplace, and above it is an arch. Very unusual. Most fireplaces have a lintel. And if this is the level of the floor, this is 2 feet above the level of the floor. In colonial buildings, the hearth is always right on the ground. And plus, it has 2 flues. One goes up this side, one up this side, 7 inches by 7 inches each. Most fireplaces just have 1 flue. This is a very unusual fireplace, but you'll see on the top, this arch was made. They put the window right there. They jammed it so close. Why did they need to have the window that close? Well, that's a clue. You can see it here, what's going on. So these are the beam sockets for the second floor. Again, I've simulated that this is the second floor. So this is a room. And inside a room, this room is 3 windows. Are 3 windows. This is the northeast window, the south window, and I'm photographing from the west window. There are also various niches that go halfway into the tower. These are all different sizes, different proportions, and you'll see these 2 windows are splayed. The sides of them are like this, and I'll show you that that's so that you can see through them this way. Well, my work is based on the work of Professor William Penhallow. He's an astronomer and a professor of physics at the University of Rhode Island for 30 years. He's since retired. And in early 1990s, he found these astronomical alignments in the windows of the tower. He says, if you stand over here near this park bench and look through the west window, through the tower, and out the northeast window, one day out of every 18.6 years, you'll see the full moon. And that day, he predicted, was December 25th, 1996. So I went there on that night, Sure enough, this is the path that the moon took through that, and when it was in the middle of it, it shone right through the two windows, just like he predicted. This is an event called lunar minor. It has to do, it's the southernmost of the northernmost risings of the moon, and it happens the next year. The moon takes this angle here, and you won't see it, and then only at this time is the southernmost of the northernmost risings visible. And he also says if you stand in this corner of the park, look through this window, through the tower, and out this window here, one day out of the year, or on or around the winter solstice, you'll see the sun right through the windows. And sure enough, it happens. And it happens like clockwork. There was one year, this is another year, and here it was another year. And I've seen it, witnessed it every year. Sometimes there's 20 or 30 people there. And, sometimes I'm there alone in the freezing cold, 6 o'clock in the morning. So there's another alignment which happens on the equinox. The sun comes through the west window at the end of the day and makes a patch of light that almost ends up in the fireplace. You see, this patch of light starts here, it works its way up, 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 and then it would end up on the right-hand side of the fireplace. We couldn't figure out why they didn't put it in the fireplace if this is what they were doing. But a half hour before sunset, it's right underneath the window here. You'll see this is just before it gets blocked by some of the houses so you can't actually see it up in this area, the houses that have been built on the west side. Well, one day the professor said that the inside of the tower acted like a camera obscura solar disk calendar room. What's that? Let's take it a section at a time. Camera obscura means a dark room. In a dark room with one small hole, the image of what's outside appears on the inside, and it's upside down, projected on the interior wall, and reversed left to right. It's like what they call a pinhole camera, or essentially, basically how a camera works. And so in my photography studio, I made a camera obscura, and I watched the sun, and it would come through on the floor, and then it would rise up onto the wall, and I drew a circle where it was every minute, and I made the path that it took, and then the next day it had moved over here. And so I studied it for an entire year, and in the summertime it was here, but by winter it was way at the other end of the studio. At sunset it would always set right here. It would get half, 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 and then it would disappear. Just like outside, it's setting half, 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 and then disappear. So I made a camera obscura solar disk at sunset calendar room, and the equinox, the sun was right in the middle of this kitchenette, and in winter it was way down this end of the studio, and on summer it was way up here. So I took that data and figured out all of the angles, and I transferred it to the interior of the tower. And you'll see this looks like a giant eyeball. All the light rays sort of crisscross as they come through. And so the winter, it was here, and then in the equinox it's here, and then in the summer, the solar disk at sunset was there. In other words, on the equinox, if the west window was all blocked up, that's where the solar disk would be. Well, I couldn't make a camera obscura in the tower, so I went down the street to this firehouse, and I asked them if I could build a camera obscura up on the top room that had a view that the tower once had over the bay. So my photo assistant, John Tavares, and I, we went up there and we set up a 9-foot seamless paper and an aperture. And this is the image of what's happening on the bay. This is Mill Street, America's Cup Avenue, and this is the sun, and this is the Pell Bridge here. But what's that bright spot? Anyone tell me what that bright spot is? It's brighter than all of the rest. Yeah, I'll give you a hint. If you hit your head upside down, it's here it is a little bit darker. It's the reflection of the sun off the bay in the late afternoon. These are little boats, and this is Goat Island out there. And here it is looking out the other way through the hole. You see that it's reflection. But in the camera obscura, you'll see this reflection on the wall. I call it fiery water. It looks like all these little blazes of light that are the reflections of the light scintillating off the waves. Now, there's a physicist in the 1600s named Robert Boyle. He's discovered Boyle's law. He was fascinated by this too. He says, in a darkened room, I use a convex lens to project the image of the sun shined on, the image of the river shined on by the sun. It looked like millions of tiny fish scales which sparkled as the wind, sun, and river changed. And so this fiery water. Now remember, this is where on the equinox, where the sun sets. Just before that, this is the path the sun takes before it reaches here. And remember, that's where that box was, about 5:15. Well, about half an hour before sunset, that's where the box is. If this west window was all blocked up, which I've simulated here in Photoshop, that's where the solar disk would be, right? You follow me on this? Well, what that means is, little drum roll, please. The fiery water is right in the middle of the fireplace. And this happens on the equinox, which is March 21st, which is the first of Aries in the zodiacal sign of Aries. Anyone here in Aries? You know what kind of sign Aries is? It's the first of the fire signs. And just before, right? Is this guy a fire sign? Yeah, I can tell. Yeah. And just before it is Pisces. We get some Pisces here? Pisces, yeah. And you know what kind of sign that is? Fish, the water sign, right. So it's when water turns into fire, the fiery water is in the middle of the fireplace. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So I said, who would have built a thing here? So here it is again in my drawing here, but this solar disk, and you could start a fire up there, and it would happen. Now, the first of Aries is very special because in ancient times, they felt the earth was created on the first of Aries. That's not just spring every year. They thought it was the spring of creation on earth. So I said, well, what about design? The tower with all of these astronomical alignments. This is very sophisticated stuff. So I decided to study the history of the camera obscura and the solar disk calendar room. Around the Middle Ages, the Arabs studied the camera obscuras. They made camera obscura rooms, and Alhazen describes making 5 candles in this one room and blowing out the last one, and the first one blew out in this room. And he saw that light traveled in a straight line. And then a monk named Helperic, around 875, he says if you make a hole in the eastern wall of your room, on the western wall, if you mark off every day at sunrise, you'll have a calendar. He was doing what I was doing in my photography studio at sunrises. I was doing sunsets at 875, 1,000 years ago. I guess I wasn't that new to the whole scene. And in the Renaissance, there was a huge interest in the camera obscura. Cardano says, add a lens and you make things much sharper. In Florence, they were designing lenses, grinding lenses, all different types, because that's when they first started making glasses. And then Da Vinci says, and so it is with the pupil. He knew that the eye acts like the camera obscura. In other words, each one of you are looking at me with 2 camera obscuras right now. Whoa, 40 camera obscuras. I can feel it. The interesting thing about a camera obscura is that the image from outside appears on the inside wall. Well, if you wait till nighttime and you turn on the inside light and it's dark outside, you'll see that the image will go outside too. So a camera obscura actually goes both ways, but it's always the brighter side that predominates. So that means as you're standing here looking at me, the image of the inside of your eye is also being projected on me. Whoa, can you see it? No. Anyways, that's conceptual, but it's truthful. Anyway, the first image we have is 1544, Geoffricius in the Northern Renaissance. He shows an eclipse of the sun in a camera obscura. Here it is, upside down. That's the moon, that's the sun. And one of his students was a guy by the name of John Dee, D-E-E. Anyone ever heard of John Dee? He was a philosopher and a mathematician and the smartest guy in Elizabethan England. Anyway, in 1700s, they used this as a drawing aid. Artists like Vermeer and Canaletto, they made camera obscura rooms and learned the art of perspective, of learning how to draw things with perspective. And this changed revolutionized art history in the Renaissance. And then in the 1800s, they put film in the back and learned how to make the first photograph. This is Nipsey. And then in the 1900s, you got Brownie box cameras, and you got Nikons and Leicas, and now we take pictures of our cell phone. But even in a cell phone, you have to have a camera obscura. So one day, I was at the library studying, and serendipity happened. You know what that means? Something lucky, something unexpected. And if you try something, work hard, all of a sudden, you'll get a breakthrough one day. Well, I was in the library and I saw this book, and it says, it was printed in 1956 by Lloyd Robson at the Newport Historical Library. He says, historical names for Narragansett Bay. Now, Refugio is what Verrazano named it in 1525, and his brother drew a map. In Maggiolo, they drew a map, and they called it Refugio, a place of refuge for an entire navy. And when Verrazano's report got out, everybody knew about it all throughout Europe. And the Spanish called this bay, Narragansett Bay, the Bay of Santa Baptista. And then I saw this, the John Dee Bay and River, 1583. I'm like, wait a minute. The Pilgrims are 1620. Why would this bay be named after an Englishman 40 years before the Pilgrims? And this is the only guy who knew about the camera, or wrote about the camera obscura in all of Elizabethan England. So I started studying about this guy, John Dee. He was a mathematician, a navigational expert for all the great navigators, all the great explorers in England, and he had a library of 4,000 books. The guy was just a polymath. And what happened in 1583 that was so special? So I call it the Elizabethan colonization effort. This fellow, John Dee, was a scholar, and he was also one of the main philosophers who guided Queen Elizabeth's reign. Here he is giving guidance, navigational guidance to the Muscovy Company. They were heading to Moscow, but he also gave advice to Martin Frobisher, who was discovering the Northwest Passage, and Stephen Burrow, the Northeast Passage. He invented a compass that allowed you to navigate at the northernmost latitudes where the longitude lines were close together. He called it a paradoxical compass. Now, you see, England had been Catholic for over 4 centuries, ever since the Norman invasion. Then all of a sudden you get Henry VIII with all of his wives, and then this white area is Edward VI, the boy king. He only lived for 5 years, but he was Protestant, or England was Protestant, and he hired 300 bishops, and then Queen Mary comes to the throne. Bloody Mary cuts the heads off the 300 bishops. And at that time, Dee got thrown into jail, and his roommate, Bartlett Greene, gets sent to the gallows. And Dee says, you know, I can be helpful to you. I know a lot about theology. Dee becomes a Catholic priest for 5 years. Then all of a sudden, Elizabeth comes to the throne. Not only is Dee instantly Protestant again, but the Queen has asked John Dee to select the most propitious day for her coronation, which he does, January 15th, 1559. And so he became her main philosopher. Anyone seen the movie with Cate Blanchett, Elizabeth? You know, and she has a problem. She can't figure something out. She calls in this wise guy with a long beard, and he gives her advice. That's Dee. That's Dee. They don't identify him in the TV show, but she had a lot of problems besides what was going on in England. Spain was becoming a superpower. They had all the gold from Mexico, the silver from Peru. They had explored the New World. They had 200 ships in their fleet. England had 22 ships. So John Dee writes a series of 8 books to Queen Elizabeth, telling her that first off, she needs to build a petty navy of 60 to 80 large ships and hire 6,000 seamen. And in this book, he invents the paradoxical compass. And in this book here, he says that the Queen has a legal right to all of North America because King Arthur, Prince Madoc, and John and Sebastian Cabot, earlier Englishmen, had been to the New World and already claimed it for England. And in the last book over here, he coins the term the British Empire. John Dee was the first guy to use that term, British Empire, which later became the world's largest empire, the sun never sets on it. This is the front cover of his book, and here he says, plura latent quam patent, more is hidden than meets the eye. This little rebus, this is a rebus where there are riddles in here, and perfect general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect art of navigation. Here the Queen, guiding the ship of state. The people of England are saying, send forth a sailing expedition, estolos es plistos menos, to build a steadfast watch post. Tostes es frerion. This is Greek. And here is the sun, God, the sun, the moon, the stars, the archangel Michael. Everything's aligned. The 5 ships have come down to the New World. They're starting to trade. And here a little community is developed that has a little dome building on the top. And so he says to the Queen, you need to seize the opportunity. This is Lady Occasion or Lady Luck. If you grab the crown of victory, then the moment can be yours. But if you don't, danger lurks. Boom, 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 boom. He calls this Hieroglyphicon Britannicon, a British hieroglyphic. And there are all these other little hidden clues in here. This shibboleth means hidden watchword. 1 month later, she deeds all of North America to this guy, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, one of her bravest war generals in the war in Ireland. And he had petitioned for the whole thing, and she said, all right, I'll give you 7 years, and all you have to do is, any place you settle there, you have to build a building and occupy it for a year. Well, he was so appreciative of the work that John Dee did for him, getting this whole North America. It's kind of a big deal, big sales pitch, right? He gives Dee all the lands north of the 50-degree line. That's all of Alaska, Canada, Greenland. It went to Dee. This was all to Gilbert, except for Florida and the Caribbean. They didn't want to mess with Spain. So you might say, well, Dee got a raw deal. No. He wanted the Northwest Passage that was going to trade with China and Japan and become fabulously wealthy on the whole thing. He didn't mind. Now, Sir Francis Walsingham, you see, Gilbert didn't have enough money. He sent one expedition out in 78, but they got 7 ships. They got halfway across the ocean, and they had to come back because of bad weather. And then he ran out of money, and he was running out of time. So Francis Walsingham, the Secretary of State, had an idea. He got this guy, Sir George Peckham, who was one of the wealthiest Catholic sympathizers. Now, the Catholics were persecuted at the time. They passed what's called the Recusancy Act. Any Catholic who didn't attend the Church of England was fined £20 a month, and if they they didn't pay, thrown into jail. The jails were filled, and all the rich Catholics were moving to the continent and taking all their money with them and helping the Catholic cause over there. So he says to Peckham, if you fund Sir Humphrey Gilbert's expedition, all the Catholics that settle in that colony in the New World can have complete freedom of religion. Well, it was win-win-win for everybody. Gilbert, for Peckham and the Catholics, but also for Walsingham, because he got the Catholics out of town because they were just causing a lot of trouble on the island. Now, David Beers Quinn, the most noted authority on Elizabethan exploration, found this deed in the Elizabethan State Papers, and between Sir Humphrey Gilbert and George Peckham. This is 1583. I deed you all that river report, called by Master John Dee the Dee River, which by the description of Verrazano lies at 42 degrees, mouth open to the south, a half a league broad, then it goes northeast for 12 leagues, makes a bay 20 leagues of circumference, in which is 5 small islands. 42 degrees, mouth open to the south, goes northeast for 12 leagues, makes a bay 20 leagues of circumference, which is 5 small islands. And Verrazano had said, because he came from New York, he said, well, you come along the coast and you'll see a triangular island, and it leads to the mouth of this bay. And he had spent a couple of weeks in here, and the Indians were very friendly, and he says it's big enough for an entire navy. That's why he called it Refugio. Well, Dee knew this, and he said, that's where we're going to start the British Empire, and that's where the first colony should be. So Peckham goes over to Dee's house, and we know this because Dee left a diary, and on June 21st, 1583, at 3:30 in the afternoon, Peckham says to Dee, are you sure Spain doesn't own all of North America? And Dee shows him this map that John Dee had drawn. This is Dee's map of North America. You see, he knew all about Florida, Cuba, Jamaica, and he says, this is where you want to go, this triangular island, which is, this is 42 degrees, and then this bay that goes northeast and makes a circle. But look, he knew about the Appalachians, he knew about the Gulf of St. Lawrence all the way down to Montreal. How did Dee know all of this stuff 40 years before the Pilgrims? His best friend was Gerard Mercader, one of the best map makers on the continent, and they all shared information from the Spanish and Portuguese and French voyages that they had accumulated. So, what happened, Jim? 5 ships set sail in 1583 with Sir Humphrey Gilbert from Plymouth, England. They made it as, well, one day out, the bark Raleigh got a contagious disease. They had to head back home. They had lost their biggest supply ship. They think it was mutiny, but they weren't sure. The other 4 ships got caught in fog, and they said, let's meet again at St. John's Bay in Newfoundland. And so they did, and he's very famous up there. Here it is, in this spot, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, on the 5th day in 1583, took possession of this newfound land in the name of Queen Elizabeth, thereby founding Britain's overseas empire. But he wasn't staying there. He only stayed there for 2 weeks to revictualize, to rest. Here he is, the stamp coming into the harbor with his 5 ships. And he's very famous. This was the commemoration in 1933 they had of him. Well, what happened was they stayed there for 2 weeks and headed down the coast. They hit a tempest off the coast of Nova Scotia, and the Delight hit a sandbar and got crushed to pieces. They lost their second supply ship. So the other ships, they headed back to England to get more men and supplies, and off the coast of the Azores, Sir Humphrey Gilbert's ship gets swallowed by a huge wave, and he drowns. Boom! The deed to North America becomes void, because it was just in his name. And so here he is, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, knight, drowned, and here he is, the brave guy. Well, he couldn't have built the tower. He didn't make it here. It's very clear. In other words, the ship that did make it back wrote a report, and you can go on the web right now and read all about Sir Humphrey Gilbert's voyage. But he didn't make it here. But a year later, the Queen deeded all of North America to his younger half-brother. I'll even show you a picture of him. Anyone know who this is? Sir Walter Raleigh made 3 expeditions to Roanoke Island in 1584, 1585, 1587. This is Gilbert's half-brother. His mother had gotten remarried. They grew up together. That was Raleigh's ship that had the bark Raleigh that had to return back. And everyone's heard of this guy, but nobody's ever heard of Gilbert because he didn't make it past Maine, and we're Americans and we don't give a shit about Canadian history. Right? We got our own history to worry about. We don't need that. So this guy Gilbert kind of got lost in history, and he couldn't have built the tower. So what am I talking about him for? Well, interesting thing was that he left on the summer solstice of 1578. That's when he got his letters patent, and he left exactly 5 years later on June 11th. These guys did things in accordance to with the sun. Now, Quinn was a great researcher. After studying all he could in London, he went to Madrid and found out that the Spanish ambassador, Don Bernardino de Mendoza, had written letters back to King Philip of Spain. And one of the letters sources. He said that in 1582, a year before Sir Humphrey Gilbert went, Gilbert and the Catholics sent 2 ships and a pinnace, a small boat that could be rowed or sailed, to the New World. They don't know exactly what they did, but they stayed there for 9 months under the leadership of a guy by the name of Anthony Brigham. And we know that he returned and spoke to Walsingham about the discovery of America, and they tried to raise new funds for the whole thing. But Brigham got back whilst Gilbert's expedition was still on. He didn't even know, and he heard later that Sir Humphrey Gilbert had drowned. Here's a list of the names written by Richard Hakluyt, a famous historian at the time, and he lists all the people that had written or been to North America, and there at the very end, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Knight, Edward Hayes, and Anthony Brigham, Englishman, 1582. And so I claim that these 2 ships and a pinnace came here, built this tower to be the city center of this first Elizabethan colony in the New World, but Sir Humphrey Gilbert never arrived, so they abandoned it, and it was forever abandoned. And this guy, John Dee, was not only the architect of the whole plan to colonize the New World, he was also the architect of the tower. He knew all this astronomy. I call it his New World horologium. Horo means hour, logium means a place, a building that keeps track of time. Now, Dee talks in his books, he wrote over 40 books, including the first English translation of Euclid. He wrote on optics. He wrote on all scientific subjects. And he quotes this fellow Vitruvius, who was who was a Roman architect. And when they found Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture in the Renaissance, it became the groundwork for all the architecture in the Renaissance. Palladio, Leon Battista Alberti, Bramante. They got everything they knew from Vitruvius. And Dee says that not only is he my favorite architect, but he quotes him in this book. In Dees' book, he quotes Vitruvius, and they both say the architect's work must be based on the principles of geometry, arithmetic, optics, music, astronomy, cosmography, indeed all the mathematical arts. By optics, I mean the lights of heaven are well led in the buildings from certain quarters of the world. That's Dees' writing. That's exactly what Penhallow found in this building. The light from the sun, moon, and stars. They go right through the building. This is a guy that's talking about building architecture with lights. He says, as for astronomy, if you don't know the equinoxes and the solstices, then you don't understand the art of horology or the art of horometry, keeping time. He says they used to call it mnemonica, and then they call it horologiographia. Now we call it dialing, sundialing. He says it takes more than a talented painter to prescribe the path of a sun's shadow, down to a hair's width, for any regular surface. When I was young, I invented horizontal dials, mural dials, equinoctial dials, but sometimes you can't see the sun, moon, and stars. And so mechanics have invented this way to use a flow of water, running sand, gears and weights. Here he says gears without weights, using springs. They just invented springs in the Renaissance. But all of these methods require correction over time because the inaccuracy of their own operation. Well, how would they correct them? With the camera obscurum. He says there remains among the philosophers a more excellent, commodious, marvelous way than all of these to imitate the motion of the primavant, or the skies, by using nature and art, which you shall understand more of by further search and weightier studies. And he calls it a perpetual motion. Well, he's talking about the image of the sun, the camera obscura, in a camera obscurum, goes across the floor, and you're able to keep track of time. Well, why doesn't he say that? Why doesn't he say make a dark room and you'll have a calendar inside? You could keep track of the days of the year. Well, the reason is, along with the image of the sun, you also have an image of everything that's outside. And if Prince George is walking by on his horse outside, Prince George is walking by upside down, and Dees, oh, you didn't have stuff like that going on, and because they'd call you a conjurer, and you'd end up being at the stake. So Dee also gives this advice to astronomers. He says, won't the astronomer regret his sleepless vigils he stoppered under the open sky, when here, without any discomfort from the air, under his own roof, with his door shut and windows shut on all sides, at any given time he can observe the movements of the heavenly bodies, and indeed without any mechanical instruments made from wood or brass? These are all riddles about the camera obscura. Now Dee calls the camera obscura an ophthalmosat. Well, camera obscura in Latin means dark room, and in Greek, an ophthalmos is a room. So this is Dee's cryptic word for it. Dee was fluent in Greek and in Latin, and he files it under the art of zoography, which is the art of drawing from life, which is painting, sculpture, and you'll notice that he puts it right in between horometry, timekeeping, and architecture. These are all sort of in the same mode for him. So Dee in 1577 writes this book called Propetumata Aphoristica, which means preparatory aphorisms, and he dedicates it to Mercator, his best buddy. And you see he's interested in classical architecture. These are Corinthian pilasters, the sun, the moon, and then a solid entablature, a dome with stars. stars, and he invents this weird little symbol called the Monas symbol, which has the moon on the top, then a sun, the cross of the elements, and the symbol for Aries, March 21st. And Johannes Dee, those are his initials, he says, can contemplate the wonders of the many fracturings of the heavenly rays in the air, clouds, and water, and you will be impelled to praise the infinite goodness and wisdom of God. Well, the reflection of the rays on the water, that's fiery water. That's the guy he's talking about fiery water right here. And when does it happen? On the 1st of Aries, which is in his symbol right here. 7 years later, so what happened was that with regards to the camera obscura is in Italy, they made these cathedrals that had already been built into camera obscura rooms. They put an aperture up at the top, they drilled a hole right into the wall, put a metal plate up there, and down in the bottom they made a meridiana or a noon line. They embedded it right into the floor. You can still visit. This is the Maria degli in Rome. This one here is Bologna. It has an aperture right here, and there's the noon line that they had to retrofit this one. They barely found a place for it to work. And you'll see it's a metal plate, and each day of the year is marked on it. And they would watch where the sun would cross every day of the year. And by watching where it crossed on the summer solstice, on the equinox, and on the winter solstice, and counting the number of days, they were able to prove to Pope Gregory XIII that the Julian calendar was out of sync from the sun, leading to the Gregorian calendar reform of 1583. This is the calendar that we still use today. And here there's the guy watching as it goes across during the day. Well, in England, the Queen didn't know what to do. She'd been excommunicated by the Pope. She didn't have to listen to what the Pope had to say. In fact, Pope said, you know, anyone who believes in Elizabeth, you're all excommunicated too. So she needed advice, because if she traded with France, she'd be off by 10 days. If she came back, it'd be just confusing. What should she do? Who did she turn to for advice? John Dee, at her request, writes a 60-page treatise on the reform of the calendar, in which he says, yeah, you can tell from these camera obscurums we're off by 10 days. We do need to make the change. He draws this thing called the circle of time, which starts down here at Adam and ends right here. Here it is in English. Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, the fall of the temple, Solomon, Olympic Games, Jesus Christ, Muhammad, Al-Kindi. The very last one, Queen Elizabeth, the reformer of the year for the next Christian epoch. And that's to begin in 1583, the exact same year I say that tower is built. So that tower not only represents the birth of this new time, but it also represents the birth of the British Empire, and it was a huge thing. Elizabeth, our Empress bright, this is Dee's poem, our Empress bright, who in the year of 83 thus made truth come to light, and civil year with heaven agree. And he says, if you change the calendar first, before the Pope, it'll be the Elizabethan calendar. You'll be the woman who changed time, forever famous. And so in 1582, John Dee was on top of the world. He had solved the problem of religious strife in England. The new world was opening up. Religious freedom, the Catholics and the Protestants. This was to be an Anglican colony here at the Dee River, but the Catholics could worship as they pleased. And the new time, well, the Queen approved the plan, the Privy Council approved the plan. They sent it to Edmund Grindal, the head of the English Church, and he said, you know, this is something the Pope is doing. We don't want to do that. And besides, he didn't like Dee, because Dee had been a Catholic priest under Queen Mary, and he knew that. And so he rejected the calendar. And for the next 169 years, the English calendar was different than the European calendars by 10 days, because they didn't listen to my man, John Dee. He was 169 years ahead of his time, just in that. So the following year, Sir Humphrey Gilbert drowns. And they rejected the calendar reform. And he had also been given these rectories of £1,000 a year, and Grindal took those away because he didn't get the official seal in time, because he was so busy writing the calendar proposal. He gets so pissed off at his countrymen, he gets in a boat and leaves England. He sails down the Thames River under cover of darkness with his family and spends the next 8 years in the courts of various kings and princes throughout Northern Europe. So John Dee, well, the question here is, what did the tower originally look like, John Dee's tower? Well, John Dee, 7 years after the Propedumata Aphoristica, wrote this book called Monas Hieroglyphica, which means sacred symbol of oneness. And in it he describes his entire mathematical cosmology. You see, here is the Monas symbol, the sun, the moon, the cross of the elements, fire, air, earth, and water, the symbol for Aries. Dee was Cancer the crab. Here is Leo the lion, Maximilian, and Aries and Taurus. The sun column, the moon column, fire, air, earth, and water symbolized in here. And he says, he who does not understand should either learn or keep silent. Well, the Queen says, John, if you teach me the secrets, I promise to learn and keep silent. And so he teaches not only Maximilian, who he dedicates this to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was in Prague at the time, but he also explains it to Queen Elizabeth as a whole private day, spending it explaining the monas. And then when he goes to Prague, he explains it to the Emperor's son. This is Rudolph, who was into alchemy and some of the stuff that Dee was into. And the heart of it is this character that Dee designs. And he says that it has to be exactly these proportions, and he goes into an entire mathematical presentation in which he says diameter of this equals the diameter of this, diameter of this equals the length of this, and it's the radius of that. Goes through all of this stuff. And at the very end of his book, he has this one chart called Thus the World Was Created that summarizes his entire mathematical cosmology. Sic factus est mundus. This is the supercelestial area up above, and here it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in the horizon of eternity, and metamorphosis consummata. And down below in the terrestrial and the etheric celestial, he's only got 1 through 7, and the monad symbol upside down and backwards. Fire, air, earth, and water. Body, mind, spirit. Black, clear, yellow, red. Alchemical stages 12, 13, 24, 25. No one's been able to figure out his book for 450 years, except there was one person who understood Dee's book and understood this chart in the last 4. Some people think that it was Sir Isaac Newton because he was a pretty smart guy, but it wasn't him. You know who was able to figure out Dee's book when nobody else in the world could? Come on, people, let's go. How about it? Come on, come on. How come me and nobody else? Nobody else cares. I got to care to figure it all out. Plus, I studied this for over 5 years, and I studied. What I did was I got a copy of the book. It's written in Latin, and I hired a Latin translator. We went through sentence by sentence, word by word. I made my own translation, and I figured out what he meant. Well, at the very end of his book, he has this chart called. He says there are various delimitibus statisticae, fixed limits within number, and he boils it all down to the magistralia number, lipidification, fermentation, and he says this number, the philosopher's stone of number, that's what that means, 252 summarizes the whole thing. And so I said, well, how am I going to figure out about 252? I'm like, I scratch my head, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. That ain't it. And so, I couldn't figure out what he meant by 252, and no one's been able to figure out for years. But I had a tool to figure out 252 that people didn't have in the 1800s and 1900s when they first started translating Dee's work. Some people think it was an abacus or a slide rule or a hand calculator or the camera obscura. Nope. You know how I figured out 252? I Googled it. Why not? I figured it's important to this guy. Maybe it's important to somebody else. And when I Googled it, this guy shows up, Buckminster Fuller, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. Now, he invented the geodesic dome. If you go down to Walt Disney World in Florida, he was the guy that invented it. It has all those triangles in it. You've seen buildings built of it and stuff. He invented it in 1950, got the patent on it. But he was also a wise geometer, and he was, and at the end of his life, he wrote these 2 books called Synergetics 1 and Synergetics 2. And when I read the 2 books, I was able to understand, because he talks about 252 and everything, I was able to understand, in other words, what Buckminster Fuller figured out in trying to determine what he calls nature's operating system in the 1900s was the exact same thing that John Dee figured out in the 1500s about what Dee calls true knowledge of God's laws and ordinances with regards to geometry and Euclidean geometry. So once I figured out Bucky, I was able to figure out John Dee. So, but I'm not going to go through all the explanation right now because I put everybody to sleep, all of the numbers. But I will tell you what I think the tower originally looked like. This is what I think originally looked like. Now, underneath each of these pillars, I said 3.5 tons of stone. Then there's these footings that are 1.5 feet high. And then the entire building was once plastered over. You can still see some of the plaster on the inside of some of the beams in a technique called sgraffito, which they would plaster something over and then faux paint it to make it look like marble or brick or stone. You can see this all throughout Europe today, in Rome and Prague. And they would put words on and letters, and they would put in shadows, and they would mark it, make it look like it was marble, but it was really just stone that had all been dressed up. Then on these shelves that stick out here, I think there was an entablature in classical buildings. When you have a vertical member, you always have a horizontal member. Vertical, horizontal, Corinthian pilasters. These would have been pilasters attached onto with metal cramp irons made out of wood. And then this would have been decorated maybe in brick colored, maybe something, but I made it red here because this is sort of an alchemical color Dee would have used. And then another entablature, and then a dome with a 6-foot finial on top. And so in other words, this part would have been made out of wood, but the rest is all stone, and even the dome would be made out of stone. And the proportions of it would be the proportions that Dee talks about in his book, the sun and the moon, the two circles, the 2-to-1 proportion, which would be 24 by 48. You go out there today and measure, it's 24 feet wide. Right now it comes up to here because the British occupied Newport in the Revolutionary War, and they stored their gunpowder in there, and they blew the top off the building. So whatever was there in 1776, right now we only have 28 feet of it. But the secret code symbol for the blueprint for the tower is the Monas symbol, the proportions that he talks about in the Monas symbol, which are very specific. In other words, you could put another same size circle down here, and this is the 6-foot finial. The proportions of it are. And in the tower, I claim that there were 3 rooms. The first floor room was a camera obscura room, in which you'd see the image of the sun at the end of the day coming through from the west and setting here. In the morning, it would come through here and be in here. And during the daytime, it would be here. And on the dome room floor would be this image, and the whole would be in the dome. And in the summertime, the sun would work its way across here, and on the equinoxes it goes across the middle, and on the winter solstice it goes across here. So it's a calendar as well as a timepiece that tell you the time of day and the day of the year. And so in other words, 3 separate rooms. There's evidence of this stairway right here, and I think that there was a trap door that they would come up into the middle of it, and the dome room that would have stars on the top floor of it. And so this is what the tower looks like now, and this is what I claim it originally looked like. And if so, that means that this is not only an important story for Newport, but it's also an important story for America and for the entire world, an international sort of a story. So I took a sabbatical from my work. I wrote these 8 books, and then I summarized it all in this one book here, which I call Elizabethan America, the John Dee Tower of 1583. I'm selling some copies here for $40 each signed. And then since then, I've written more books. I just finished my 20th book on the tower, because when you open a door to something that's right, or you have some idea, they're all different stories. In other words, one book is on the Turo Park in the 1800s and what Richard Morris Hunt, one of the greatest architects in America, thought about the tower. And you can see more at the NewportTowerMuseum.com, my website. But I don't want to bore you anymore tonight, so that's my story. Thank you.